If you open a map of the US and look at the southern part of the country, it kind of feels like one big oil zone. Texas and New Mexico. That's where most of the production is happening right now. And then there's North Dakota. As of 2026, the US is still #1 in the world. On average, the country produces around 13 to 13.5 million barrels of crude oil per day. That's more than any other country. Saudi Arabia and Russia come next, but there's still a pretty big gap. And if you're producing more oil than anyone else, you'd expect to fully cover your own needs, and then sell the rest. But that's not how it actually works. The US is still one of the biggest oil importers in the world. And this isn't occasional, it's constant. Canada, Mexico, Guyana, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries ship oil into the US every single day. If you look at the full picture, it's dozens of routes and a steady supply system. At first, there's a simple explanation. The US is also the largest oil consumer in the world, around 20 million barrels a day. So it makes sense. High demand means you need extra supply. But if you take another look at how oil actually moves, something else starts to stand out. The US isn't just buying oil, it's also selling it, and in huge volumes. The country is one of the top 4 oil exporters in the world. So a big part of that oil doesn't stay inside the country. It gets shipped out somewhere else. And that raises a different question. It's not about whether the US has enough oil. The real question is, why go through the more expensive process of importing oil when you already produce so much of it yourself? Let's start with a simple question. How much oil does the US actually have? There's a huge amount of it underground. Proven reserves alone are estimated at around 50 billion barrels. And a big part of that oil still isn't being used. On top of that, massive areas have already been set aside for drilling. Millions of acres, both on land and offshore, have been leased to oil companies, but nothing is happening there. They're just sitting unused. So the question seems pretty obvious. If the oil is there, if the land has already been approved, and if the technology exists to extract it, why not just produce more instead of importing oil from other countries? It feels like that's exactly how it should work. But even if the US started using more of its own oil, imports wouldn't go away. And remember, we're still talking about the world's top oil producer. A few years ago, production hit record levels, and it's stayed very high ever since. If you compare production and consumption, it gets even stranger. In some years, the US has produced almost as much oil as it consumes. That means the country could nearly fully supply itself. But imports never stopped. Tankers keep arriving every single day. Oil keeps coming in from Canada, Mexico, the Middle East, and South America. This isn't occasional, it's a constant system. So if the US is already producing almost as much oil as it uses, why does it still keep buying oil from other countries? To answer that question, you have to understand one simple thing people often miss. Oil is not a finished product. Almost nobody uses it directly. A barrel of crude oil by itself isn't useful. It has to be refined. And that's where things start to get interesting. The value of oil isn't just about how much of it you have. It also depends on where it's produced, how easy it is to transport, and how it can be processed. All of that directly affects how useful it actually is. And there's another key detail. Not all oil is the same. It's not just some black liquid that's identical everywhere. Oil can be different in density, sulfur content, how thick it is, and the amount of impurities. And those differences really matter. They determine what you can actually do with it. If you simplify it, you can split oil into 2 main types, light and heavy. Light oil is less dense, flows more easily, and is easier to refine. It's better for producing things like gasoline and other lighter fuels. Heavy oil is thicker and denser, with more complex compounds. Turning it into usable fuel takes a lot more processing. And this is where the problem starts. You can't process all types of oil the same way. Refineries aren't built to handle everything. They're designed and tuned for specific types of crude. So just because you have oil doesn't mean you can use it anywhere or however you want. Yes, the US produces a huge amount of oil, but a large share of that oil is light. At the same time, a large part of the country's refineries are set up to run heavier crude. That means the oil being produced and the refining system don't really match. And this is where things start to look strange. Light oil is easier to refine and in high demand, so it often makes more sense to sell it overseas. Meanwhile, the US still has to import heavy crude, because that's what many refineries are designed to run on. To understand why US refineries are set up this way, you have to go back to how the system was built before the shale boom. Back in the late 20th century, the US didn't have large amounts of its own light oil. A big share of the supply came from other countries. The main suppliers, Venezuela, Mexico, and Canada, were exporting heavy crude. And this wasn't short-term, it was stable, long-term supply. The entire system was built around it. Refineries were upgraded to process heavy oil as efficiently as possible. These weren't simple facilities. They used more complex equipment that could break down dense crude and turn it into higher-value products like diesel and industrial fuels. And these weren't temporary upgrades, they were long-term investments. By the time the shale boom started in the US, this whole system was already in place. Refineries were running, logistics were built out, and supply contracts were active. Everything was designed around a specific type of oil. Then large volumes of light oil started being produced inside the country. But the infrastructure didn't change overnight. Refineries don't just switch to a different type of crude. Their equipment is designed for specific properties: density, composition, sulfur levels. As a result, new oil showed up in a system that was built for a different kind of oil. And this isn't a mistake. It's just what happens when production changes faster than infrastructure. That's why the current situation isn't random. It's the result of decisions made decades ago, when the market looked completely different and heavy crude was the main feedstock for US refineries. This is what the system looks like right now. Light oil is produced in Texas and North Dakota. Some of it goes to refineries inside the US, but a large share is sent out through ports. The main destinations are Europe and Asia, where there's strong demand for this kind of oil. At the same time, heavy crude is still coming in. It moves through pipelines from Canada or arrives by tanker from other countries. That oil goes to large refineries that were originally built to process it. Inside the country, there's also blending. Light and heavy oil can be mixed to create the kind of crude a specific refinery needs. That helps balance things out, but it doesn't fully solve the problem. In the end, the system looks like different flows crossing each other. Imports and exports are happening at the same time, and they don't replace each other. Each one serves its own purpose in the bigger system. But why go through such a complicated system like this? If the issue is a mismatch between the type of oil and the refineries, then the obvious solution would be to rebuild refineries to handle a different type of oil. Well, in reality, that's extremely difficult and expensive. Refineries are some of the most expensive industrial facilities out there. Upgrading or converting one can cost billions of dollars. This isn't just swapping out one machine, it means changing the entire process. Then there's the time factor. Projects like this take years, and during upgrades, capacity can drop significantly, which can affect fuel supply across the country. There's also the economic side. The current system already works and makes money. Refineries that are set up for heavy crude are optimized for it and can produce the products they need efficiently. Switching to light oil doesn't always give the same financial result. So instead of rebuilding the whole system, companies go with the simpler option. They keep using the system as it is, with imports and exports running at the same time. But there's another important piece of this. There's also the Jones Act, passed back in 1920. It requires cargo between U.S. ports to be carried on ships that are built in the U.S., owned by U.S. companies, and crewed by Americans. And that makes domestic shipping extremely expensive. As a result, you get situations like this. Oil from Texas gets shipped to Asia because it's cheaper. Meanwhile, the east coast of the U.S. ends up bringing in oil from Europe or Africa. It sounds absurd, but that's how it actually works. And if you imagine the U.S. trying to cut off imports completely and rely only on its own oil, the consequences would be serious. First, parts of the system just wouldn't work. Some refineries wouldn't be able to process light oil at the volumes they need. Second, Huge investments in the existing infrastructure would become stranded. Third, you'd run into serious logistics problems. Oil isn't produced where it's needed, and there isn't always a fast way to move it across the country. So in the end, a lot of it has to move by sea. If you look at the system today, it works very well, and it's not standing still. So there's no real reason to change it. Instead, it's slowly adapting. And one of the biggest changes is where heavy oil is coming from. In the past, a large share of heavy crude came from Venezuela, but sanctions and political restrictions cut that flow sharply. That created pressure on the system, because Venezuelan oil was a good fit for refineries along the Gulf Coast. As a result, the US became more dependent on Canada. Heavy crude from Canada, especially from Alberta's oil sands, has become a key source for many US refineries. It moves through pipelines and provides a steady supply that replaces supplies that disappeared from other sources. Mexico and some Latin American countries still play a role, but their volumes are limited. That means the system is becoming more dependent on a single major supplier. At the same time, things are changing inside the refineries themselves. Some refineries are being gradually upgraded to handle a wider range of crude. But this isn't a full rebuild, it's gradual adjustments. Most refineries still can't fully switch to light oil without major changes. Another important piece is blending. Companies are increasingly mixing light and heavy crude to create feedstock that fits specific refinery setups. This gives them more flexibility when supply or prices change. But even with all these changes, the basic logic of the system stays the same. The US continues to export light oil and import heavy crude. The problem doesn't go away, it just gets smoothed out. And that's why the system doesn't break, even though it looks contradictory. It keeps the same basic principle. Different types of oil keep moving in different directions because they serve different roles inside the same economy. And now that the system makes more sense, you can look at another country where things look almost like a mirror image: Canada. If you open a map of North America, Canada looks like a true oil giant, especially if you look at Alberta. That's where some of the largest oil reserves in the world are located, the oil sands. By proven reserves, Canada ranks among the top countries, behind only giants like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. It looks like a perfect setup: huge reserves, steady production, and right next to the biggest market in the world, the United States. You'd expect Canada to fully control its oil and make the most out of it. But if you look closer, the problem there is completely different. In the US, most of the oil is light, while many refineries are set up for heavy crude. In Canada, it's the opposite. Most of the oil there is heavy crude, and not just heavy, extremely dense and thick bitumen. It's so thick that you can't just pump it out of the ground like regular oil. It has to be heated underground, or mined together with sand, and then processed separately. And this is where the first problem shows up. This kind of oil is hard to transport. It has to be diluted with lighter oil or processed on site. That alone increases the cost. On top of that, Canada doesn't have enough refining capacity to handle all of it domestically. There aren't enough refineries to cover production. So you get a situation that looks strange. Canada produces huge amounts of oil, but can't fully process it at home. So it gets sent to the US, specifically to the same Gulf Coast refineries we talked about earlier, the ones built to handle heavy crude. And this is where the two systems connect. Canada exports heavy oil because it lacks the infrastructure to process it. The US imports heavy oil because its refineries are built for it. It's a perfect fit. But for Canada, that also means dependence. A large share of its oil is sold below global prices simply because there aren't many alternative routes. The main market is the US, and without access to other markets, Canada has to accept the conditions that come with it. There have been attempts to fix this. Canada has tried multiple times to build new pipelines to reach other markets, for example, to the Pacific coast and then to Asia. But these projects keep running into protests, environmental restrictions, and political decisions. As a result, many of them get delayed for years or canceled entirely. And that creates another contradiction. Canada is one of the richest countries in terms of oil reserves, but it can't fully control how that oil is processed or sold. The US is the largest oil producer, but it can't fully use its own supply. So in the end, they become dependent on each other. If the US problem is a mismatch between oil types and infrastructure, then Canada's problem is a lack of infrastructure and limited export options. Different causes, but in some ways the same outcome. Neither country can fully isolate its oil system, and that's why this whole system doesn't work like a closed system inside one country. It works as a connected network, where each part depends on the other.